Hello and welcome to another episode of Entry Level Esports. My name is Trent, and before we get started today, ordinarily on the show we take your questions and we mold them into esports wisdom, which is wonderful and fun for everybody. But we're actually going to be changing the format of the show a little bit. As we've been going along, I've realized that a lot of the time I end up with something I really want to talk about on here that doesn't get asked as a question, or the questions that are asked don't really give me enough time to properly research and prepare for the show before we actually have to record the episode. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the format of the show to where I'm just going to pick a topic, and that will allow me to have a little bit more time to prepare and to research and to write the script for the episode, which should lead to better content as a whole. It will unfortunately mean that the show won't be that Q&A style on every week as it's normally been, but if people are interested, we are open to exploring the idea of maybe doing some Q&A episodes once a month or periodically. You can always just shoot me a message on Twitter if you've got esports related questions. I'm happy to chat on there or in the Trolls GG Discord. I'm definitely all about everybody learning about esports, but for this show specifically, I think it's going to be better going forward if I can talk about the things I'm most excited and passionate about talking about that week, and I can properly prepare and do the research. So to that point, what we're going to be talking about today is all the different ways in which I was wrong about the North American HGC at the beginning of this year. For anyone that read any of my content or listened to me on the Trollin' HGC podcast or followed me on Twitter at all, I had three very distinct opinions that I took that I was completely wrong about. I thought that Team 12 was going to run away with the regular season. They were going to be undefeated and be unquestionably the best team, and they've performed well, but they have definitely not lived up to that expectation. I had no faith in the Tempo Storm super team. I thought that they were going to struggle early on and either find a way to get better after the clash or completely implode, and they have very much exceeded those expectations. And I was very high on Space Station. I thought that they had put together a really, really great roster that was going to be contending with the top teams and that they had a potential to make the Western Clash this season. And outside of their recent upset of Team Freedom, they've definitely not lived up to those expectations or to their own expectations as a team. So I was very wrong about all three of those teams. And what I wanted to do today was to research a little bit and figure out, why did these teams not meet the expectations that I had for them? Because I've been right about a lot of other things. I was higher on Diamond Skin than most teams. I like everybody else, thought Dignitas was going to be overwhelmingly powerful. I expected Fnatic to be good but struggle. I made a lot of right predictions, but on these three, I was completely off. And I've done some research and I've looked into some of the differences between these teams and why some are not succeeding where they should be and some are succeeding more than I thought that they should. And I think it really boils down a lot to how these teams and how the successful teams are drafting, and specifically how big their hero pools are. And that's what I looked at and what I want to kind of explain to you guys today. So what I did was I looked at 5 teams. I looked at Team Dignitas because they're doing something right and everybody should be following what they're doing. I looked at Team Freedom, who have definitely exceeded everyone's expectations and performed phenomenally well. And then I looked at the 3 teams I was wrong about, Team 12, Space Station, and Tempo Storm, to take a look at how many different heroes they've played in each role. And so quickly, as it's going to come up on screen, I'm going to run through the diversity at each position for each team, and then we'll interpret what that data means going forward. So first up is Team Dignitas. Team Dignitas in the support position has played 5 distinct heroes. At tank, they've played 7. In the offlane, they've only played 5 heroes. Wubby has only played 5 different heroes through 4 weeks of play. At the ranged position, they've played 7. And at flex, Snitch has played 10 different heroes. Now, obviously, they have had more 3-0s than most teams, so the data is a little bit less useful for Dignitas, but it still, I think, shows through 4 weeks a pretty distinct difference when we look at the other teams. So going on to Team Freedom, At support, they've played 6 heroes. At tank, they've played 8. In the off lane, they've played 7. At ranged, they've only played 4 distinct ranged heroes in a composition. Now, when I say ranged, I don't mean in their double threat compositions. I mean specifically the ranged position on the team, the dedicated carry. They've only put 4 different heroes in that position. And then at flex, they've only used 6. So they're way less diverse in the flex role than Dignitas were. Team 12 has played 7 supports. They've used 7 different tanks. In the off lane, Goku has played 10 different heroes already through 4 weeks of play. They've used 6 different heroes in the ranged carry position, and at flex, they've used 9. So they have a way wider range than Dignitas or Freedom. Space Station goes even further. At support, they've played 6. At tank, they've played 7. In the off lane, they've used 11 different heroes. Some of that has been different people on different roles, but in that position, there have been 11 distinct heroes used. They've also used 8 different ranged heroes as their primary carry. And they've had 11 different flex heroes. Finally, Tempo Storm, which is where I really realized how important this data was. Tempo Storm, we've looked at Tempo Storm and seen these Kerrigans, these Cho'Galls, Glaurung on Ragnaros, they've had Medivh in there. They seem like a really wacky team with all kinds of pocket picks and cheese strategies, but that's just not true when you look at the data. At support, they've played 7 heroes, which is on the high end, but at tank, they've only played 6, and in the off lane, counting Cho'Gall, Glaurung has played a total, can you guess how many heroes? Quick pause the video and type in the comments below how many heroes you think Glaurung has played. One of the most flexible players, all about the Medivhs and the whatnots when he was on Roll20. Glaurung has played a total of 5 heroes through 4 weeks of play. 5. And then at range, they've played 9, and in flex, they've only played 7. So, if we take that data and we total it up to find the distinct differences between the teams, we look and see that Dignitas and Tempo Storm have played 34 distinct heroes throughout the season. Team Freedom have played even less at 31. And then the 2 teams that have been underperforming my expectations, Team 12 and Space Station, have played 39 heroes and 43 heroes respectively. And the reason I feel like this is so important is because the teams that are succeeding are playing fewer heroes than the teams that are struggling. And what this means is the teams that are being successful not only have a clear core identity for their team, but they are drafting specifically to their strengths and taking what they want in basically every single draft that they play. You know, if you look, Glaurung and Wubby have both played very few heroes compared to Goku, who's considered one of the best offlaners in the world, but has been struggling this season. But if you look at Wubby's hero pool versus Glaurung's hero pool, they're completely different. Glaurung is always on a Malthael, a Ragnaros, a Zeratul, something that's got hyper damage, hyper threat, whereas Wubby is mostly on tanks, on Leorics and Blazes and things like that. These teams have identified that they need to streamline and focus on what works for them, and they've identified what works. But what works for them is completely different. And I think that's really what's so important. If you look at Team 12 and you look at Space Station specifically, they had a massive role swap at the start of the season. They went from Casanova at tank, Equinox at offlane, and Jason at flex, to Jason in the offlane, Equinox back at tank, Casanova on ranged, and Jay Shrita moving to the flex position, but really excelling on mages and playing a whole bunch of different stuff. And then one game they cheesed out a win by switching everybody up and putting Jason on the Lost Vikings. You know, they've swapped off again, and they've even done some weird stuff like having a no-tank composition where Equinox was on Dahaka. They've just been desperately searching for answers and trying everything under the sun to try and find a win rather than streamlining and focusing on what works. And in fact, that's the key difference. If you look at their win against Team Freedom, they really streamlined what they were playing and focused on what worked. They focused on putting Jay Shritta on mages where he'd excelled. They focused on always having Equinox on a Nubarak so that he could be more aggressive, he could eliminate someone from the fight, he could dive more effectively and have more damage rather than just being a raw tank. And if you look, the one game that they lost in that series against Freedom was the one game where they deviated away from that, where they went Alex Straza as their support, where they went Johanna as their tank, where they went Arthas in their offlane. Tychus, this was the only game we saw Tychus as their primary ranged hero, as opposed to Genjis and Cassias and things like that. So the team kind of figured out the formula that works for them, and the 3 games they employed that formula, they won against the best team in the region, and the one game they deviated from that formula, they lost. So to me, this is really important, and one of the most important things in Heroes of the Storm to understand about yourself, and one of the reasons that a coach is so important to a team, because a coach can look at your team as a whole and figure out, okay, where are we successful, where do we struggle, and how do we formulate our drafts around what makes us work. The reason I was so concerned about Tempo Storm is because they were mirroring the failed Gale Force 4 Flex experiment. And they had a bunch of Flex players that weren't really identified as having clear roles. They were putting Glaurung in the off lane, which was where he had been replaced by Goku on Roll20 when they had become more successful. So I was really concerned that none of that was going to work. But what Tempo Storm and what Kala have done is they've built their drafts around these specific players rather than around a generalized meta. They're putting Psalm on Kerrigan because Kerrigan is a hero where Psalm specifically can shine, and they're drafting compositions that make Kerrigan even better and make her superior and play to her strengths. They're not sticking Glaurung on a bunch of tanks. They're sticking him on heroes that can get in the backline, can do damage, can be mobile. They're putting him on Ragnaros so that they have a bunch of clear and they have defensive options if their dive doesn't work successfully. They're putting him on Zeratul so that he can pop off in the backline. They're putting Psalm on the Medivh so that he can protect Glaurung when he gets aggressive. They're streamlining their tank play to specifically what Cattle is good at. They're playing more Stitches than other teams are. They've found this identity and this formula that works for them. It wouldn't work for any other team. If LFM or Space Station or Team 12 tried to play the specific drafts that Tempo are playing, it wouldn't work for them. They wouldn't have the success that Tempo is having because these are the drafts that work for Tempo Storm. And so my hope is that going forward, Team 12 and Space Station will recognize that they have not found their identity and their recipe for success, that they will streamline their drafts, and that they will focus on drafting towards their most winning formula, whatever that might be for their team. They have way more data in scrims than I do, so I'm not going to try and interpret for them what would be their best strategy, but they need to focus on identifying it and executing on that in their drafting. And it looks like Space Station has already done that based on the data that we have from their win against Team Freedom. So it'll be interesting to see what Space Station does. Do we see more Jay Shritta on mages? Do we see more priority on a Nubarak and these dive and damage friendly tanks? Do we see more focus on Uther and Malfurion for Tomster and more passive safe tanks and offlaners for Jason? Because this is the recipe that worked against Team Freedom. Can they replicate it consistently to find that winning formula against other teams? So in closing, this is all fun and interesting for the pro scene, but how does it affect you and your friends and how you draft in your games? Or if you're building an amateur team or an open division team, what can you learn from this and how can you employ it in your own games? And I think the most important lesson to take away is to just understand that it's not actually a strength to play everything unless you're Snitch. If you're Snitch and you're genuinely one of the best players in the game and you genuinely can play everything at a high level, play everything. Most likely, you're not Snitch. Even most pro players are not Snitch. And as a result, it's okay to be honest with yourself and say, I can play 4 heroes at an elite level. I've got a couple of other pocket picks, but really I'm going to shine and excel on about 4 heroes. And so my team needs to draft to get those 4 heroes and to deny the enemy team counters to those 4 heroes. And the rest of the team needs to build their composition around those 4 heroes so that they can set me up for success. Streamline your drafting. Acknowledge that you can't play everything and that that's okay. And finally, play what works for you. When you see a draft in the HGC, don't just say, oh, we should play that because it won. Ask yourself why it won for that team. Why is Dignitas having more success with Tracer than other teams are? Why are other ranged players not playing as much Tracer and Gul'dan as Poik is? Why is Wubby always on a tank in the off lane as opposed to playing more damage-focused heroes? You know, why is Freedom putting such an emphasis on tank Tyrael? Ask yourself these questions rather than just trying to put that hero into your composition. Ask yourself why it's working for that team, and will that specific strategy work for your team? And if it doesn't, that's okay. Play what works for you. Find compositions that work for where you are strongest and play to your strengths so that you can win more consistently and you can learn how to execute on a few refined compositions rather than just trying to play everything. Because as has been proven in the pro scene this season, playing everything just doesn't work. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Entry Level Esports and that you've learned a little bit of something so that you can leave better than when you came here. If you want to get more up-to-date information about the HGC and you want to know when the next episode of Entry Level Esports will be coming up, make sure to follow TrollsGG on Twitter and myself at Trent_Esports. And until then, I will see you next week.